No poet of the 20th century has been more influential among poets, less read by the public, or more controversial to both than Ezra Pound. He is the man to whom T.S. Eliot dedicated The Wasteland, and the man of whom James Joyce said, "We all owe him a great deal, and I most of all, surely." Here is W.H. Auden on Pound.
There are very few living poets, even if they are not conscious of having been influenced by Pound, who could say, well, my work would be exactly the same if Mr. Pound had never lived.
And Ernest Hemingway speaking of the Nobel Prize.
I would have been very happy if the prize had been awarded to Mr. Pound either last year, when it was awarded to me, or this year. And I would be very pleased if it was awarded to him next year.
Yet this same man is now half forgotten, still considered by some to be a traitor to his country, and committed to a federal institution for the insane. This program is a tribute to Ezra Pound on the occasion of his recent 70th birthday. To celebrate this event, the Yale Broadcasting Company has recorded especially for this broadcast the voices of those who know him best and the critical comments of some of the most prominent living men of letters. Pound's literary career began in his college days at the University of Pennsylvania. That was many years ago, but the memory was still fresh in the mind of a kindly pediatrician who sat in his white frame house in Rutherford, New Jersey, and reflected upon the events of a long and eventful friendship. Dr. William Carlos Williams, distinguished poet in his own right, recalled his first encounter with Ezra Pound.
I was a freshman at the University of Pennsylvania when one of my friends, a roommate, who heard me playing my violin out of sheer loneliness, he was an accomplished pianist, and he had a grand piano in his room right, they must have brought it in through the window because he had it there. And I told him that I was interested in writing, and he said, "Oh, you'd be interested to meet a guy in our class. He is raising hell in the class. He is questioning everything the prof says, and it makes quite a commotion, and all the class is interested." So I said, all right, Van, bring the guy in some afternoon. And Ezra didn't require 2 invitations. He just came right away. We talked, and he was interested, and he asked me if I wrote. I said, yes, I did write. I'm not a writer. I'm just a kid writing whatever I please, keeping a more or less of a log of my intellectual development. We all think we're a hell of wise guys when we're kids, and so I've had a journal which I kept. Well, after that, Ezra came pretty frequently, and we became fast friends. He was in the college and carrying on and taking Romance language, and I was taking medicine, but languages. And I spoke a little Spanish, and I knew French pretty well, and that was all meat for him. He approved thoroughly, and one of the first things that he told me that I remember that interesting to others is that at that time he had written a sonnet, a daily sonnet, every day for a year, and destroyed them, burnt them up in the furnace after the year, and never wrote any other sonnets, as far as I know. he was not interested. And I think I've always impressed me that he wasn't particularly interested in the staid demeanor of a sonnet, the iambic pentameter cut off short, and he would never be cut off. He would talk forever, and always with his twitch and his cough, which is characteristic of him out of sheer embarrassment, I imagine. Maybe he not embarrassment, because he was always forcing his opinion, and he had a very good voice. Well, I liked him very much, and from that time we became friends.
Pound was an iconoclast even then. Certainly he was far different from most of his fellow students. He left Penn after his sophomore year and transferred to Hamilton College. Thinking of these days, Archibald MacLeish, a stern, heavy-jawed Harvard English professor, swiveled in his chair and pulled a letter from his study shelves. He held the letter carefully, for it was old and very valuable to him.
I have one source of information about him that might interest you and might interest people at Yale. A number of years ago, Alexander Wolcott gave me a letter which had been written to him by a member of the faculty of Hamilton College, where Pound spent his last 2 years. And if you'd like me to, I'll read a few paragraphs of this. I'm sure neither the late Mr. Wolcott nor the author of this letter would have any objection, since the information is all pretty well in the public field. Well, he says that Pound entered Hamilton as a junior from Pennsylvania University, and he talks a little about his difficulties with his classmates at Hamilton, students there. And then he goes on to say some things that throw a little light on the man. He says, I believe that Dr. X and I saw him more frequently in our houses than did others of the faculty. He came to my house rather often, sometimes at an unusual hour. Thus, one evening in his senior year, at 11:40, my bell rang. I opened the door, and there was Ezra. Coming from Utica, I saw a light in your study, the only welcoming light on College Street. May I come in? We sat by the fire. I had a lot of locust wood, which burned with a blue, I guess this word is, with a blue flame. Smoked and talked till nearly 3 o'clock. A good deal about Auden. He had picked up an old German translation from the English of Macpherson and was enthusiastic. Then the talk was of Anglo-Saxon poetry. Anglo-Saxon was then an election for seniors, he says. Pound had tried his hand at verse in Anglo-Saxon and had experimented with adaptations from the Chronicle in modern English imitations of the Anglo-Saxon verse forms. And there was talk of some of the later Victorians, Lang and Dobson, whom Pound disliked. Another evening we talked about Milton. And he goes on about Pound's rage at a man teaching a course in Milton, whom he, Pound, thought was guilty of Bentley's edition of Paradise Lost, in which Bentley undertook to restore the poem to its original. I don't know if you gentlemen are familiar with that curious work of scholarship. And then the letter goes on. I recall his indignation one day in the classroom when, in connection with the lyrics of Morris and Rossetti, I had read Calverley's famous parody, Butter and Eggs and a Pound of Cheese. Pound had a Schwarmer eye just then for precisely those ballads with a refrain. And, of course, he went on with them, as you probably know. One Sunday, coming out of chapel, he introduced his father and mother who were visiting him. Let's see whether I ought to read this or not. Well, this has, yes, I guess so. With a wry face, he remarked that while he was in Utica to meet them the day before, some students had set up his room. So apparently, like many geniuses, he was regarded as a bit odd. In fact, the letter goes on in this way. His work as a student was often brilliant but erratic. I suppose his study of Old French and Provençal with Dr. Shepherd influenced him more profoundly than anything else in his college course. Commons Hall, where he boarded, was not at its best. Perhaps that is why he ventured on great experiments with food, such as pie spread thick with butter. Calling on a colleague of mine, he asked if he might go to the bathroom. After half an hour or more, he came down, having enjoyed a good hot bath in the middle of his call. And then, after all this fantasy, one serious observation, how vigorously he protested against the dictum of another colleague of mine, the great poet is always a teacher. And the author of this letter says, "I'm glad he protested." Well, you get a picture there of the kind of man he was. He had a quick and lively intelligence then, as he has always had. He never has suffered fools gladly, and I guess his classmates at Hamilton were made aware of that fact. But he very clearly had the enormous respect of those who were able to understand his mind, his teachers and others.
Pound was serious about his work at Hamilton, but William Carlos Williams could remember another side to that seriousness.
After his first 2 years, the first 2 years that I knew him, he was sent away to Hamilton, where he put on an act. He wore a big hat with a plume in, and he was supposed to be Bertrand de Born, I think. He carried it through his whole year, the year he was there, he carried on, and the student body put him down for a nut. Well, he maintained it. He maintained it, and he couldn't be fooled with. He wasn't kidding. Whatever he did, he did it with absolute seriousness.
Pound, always the restless wanderer, soon left this country. In 1908, he went to London, where his red beard, flowing hair, and cape made him a familiar figure. The following years were ones of severe economic deprivation for Pound, but he never failed to act the role of the great poet. Dr. Williams knew him then, too.
He was living rather poor in London, in Paris, on Church Walk. He shared his bed with me. He slept on the couch, or slept on the floor, and gave me his bed to sleep on. We neither of us had any money. We went out for supper at a restaurant, maybe a popular restaurant, not a swanky restaurant, but Ezra selected the cheapest thing on the menu, which was a risotto, which is a rice dish and probably very cheap. We had the risotto, a dish of rice, and with perhaps whatever else it was, but the risotto was the pièce de résistance, and we finished. Ezra had his overcoat on his big hat, almost ridiculous. It looks like a Texas Ranger, but that was his badge at the time in London. He had an overcoat, a heavy overcoat, that kept him warm, but that he put on his bed. It was his sole garment. He had to be warm, after all, and he had no money, and so he couldn't buy clothes. And he wore his hat and his heavy coat. Well, we got through our meal, and the bill was paid, and the time had arrived for him to put on his coat. Well, I, being his friend, I took the coat, the heavy coat, to put it over his shoulders. And, he was wild. That's a menial's business. And he took the coat and gave it to the waiter, and made the waiter hold it, while the whole restaurant was in roars to see this act being consummated. But he put the coat on with all the airs in the world, and didn't make any gesture to put my coat on. So the waiter helped me too, and then we went out to the applause of the populace. That was a grand gesture. Once we went to the Tate Gallery, and there were very few people in the gallery, and maybe it was a Monday morning, whatever it meant there were few people, almost no one there. but some attendants were putting up something near the ceiling. They were standing on tall ladders, and they spotted Ezra. And Ezra had spotted a very attractive lady who was, he was going over she was doing it all the things that you see on the burlesque stage. Oh, not exactly on the burlesque stage, but she was making it very apparent that she noticed Ezra and was interested in being noticed. And Ezra was, he was beside himself. He was twirling his mustache and looking at her in the grandest. She was a very attractive woman, lady, and the men who were handling the ceiling noticed that carrying on, and I thought they would fall off the ladder. They were laughing so hard, and Ezra placed himself in the middle of the Tate Gallery and just looked up and stared these guys into silence, and just stared at him, and then he went on with his flirtation.
As Dr. Williams later remarked, he really lived the poet as few of us had the nerve to live that exalted reality in our time. In his early days in London, Pound helped to found a group which came to be known as the Imagist movement. A publication resulted, Des Imagistes, which marked a reaction against the prevailing literary tendencies.
When he published Des Imagistes, it was quite a good thing. It was a very striking thing, but he couldn't be limited by that. The image was very important to him as a cleansing gesture. The poems in the 1890s, American magazine first, he couldn't tolerate. Oh God, he hated it, and to get rid of the stink of American magazine verse, he invented his famous don'ts, which I have forgotten, which you can refresh your memory, but he said the poem should be written as well as a piece of prose. It should not, no inversions of the phrase would be permitted, and it would be not a colloquial language, but a sensible language which would have the grammatical construction of a good piece of prose was his ideal of a poem.
At this time, Pound was also making translations from Provençal, Latin, and Anglo-Saxon. His translation from the Anglo-Saxon of the Seafarer still remains one of his finest achievements. When Pound visited the United States in 1939, he recorded portions of his work for the Harvard Library. A passage from the Seafarer was among these recordings.
May I, for my own self, songs to root reckon, journeys, jargon, how I in harsh days hardship endured oft. Bitter breast cares have I abided, known on my keel many a care's hold and dire sea surge. And there I oft spent narrow night watch nigh the ship's head, while she tossed close to cliffs, Coldly afflicted, my feet were by frost benumbed. Chill its chains are, chafing sighs hew my heart round, and hunger begot mere weary mood. Lest man know not that he on dry land loveliest liveth, list how I care, wretched on ice-cold sea, weathered the winter, wretched outcast, deprived my kinsman, hung with hard ice flakes where hail scur flew. There I heard naught save the harsh sea and ice-cold wave, at whiles the swan cries. Did for my games the gannets clamour, seafowl's loudness was for me laughter, the muse singing all my mead drink. Storms on the stone cliffs beaten fell on the stern in icy feathers. Full oft the eagle screamed with spray on his pinion.
Pound also made a series of translations from the Latin of Sextus Propertius. Many critics consider these to be his most skillful recreations.
When, and whenever death closes our eyelids, moving naked over Acheron, upon the one raft, victor and conquered together, Marius and Jugurtha together, one tangle of shadows. Caesar plots against India, Tigris and Euphrates shall from now on flow at his bidding. Tibet shall be full of Roman policemen. The Parthians shall get used to our statuary and acquire a Roman religion. One raft on the veiled flood of Acheron, Marius and Jugurtha together. Nor at my funeral either will there be any long trail bearing ancestral lares and images, no trumpets filled with my emptiness. Nor shall it be on an italic bed, the perfumed cloths shall be absent. A small plebeian procession, enough and in plenty. There will be 3 books at my obsequies, that I take my not unworthy gift to Persephone. You will follow the bare scarified breast, nor will you be weary of calling my name, nor too weary to place the last kiss on my lips when the Syrian onyx is broken. He who is now vacant dust was once the slave of one passion. Give that much inscription, death, why tardily come? You sometimes will lament a lost friend, for it is a custom, this care for past men. Since Adonis was gored in Idalia, and the Cytherean ran crying with outspread hair, in vain you call back the shade, in vain, Cynthia, vain call to unanswering shadow. Small talk comes from small bones.
And as always, Pound was working with the younger poets, among them an American named T.S. Eliot. Eliot has never forgotten his early help. He has written of Pound in that period, "No one could have been kinder to younger men or to writers who, whether younger or not, seemed to him worthy and unrecognized." No poet, furthermore, was, without self-depreciation, more unassuming about his own achievement in poetry. It was in 1922 that I placed before him in Paris the manuscript of a sprawling, chaotic poem called The Wasteland, which left his hands reduced to about half its size in the form in which it appears in print. I should like to think that the manuscript, with its suppressed passages, had disappeared irrevocably. Yet, on the other hand, I should wish the blue penciling on it to be preserved as irrefutable evidence of Pound's critical genius. But Pound was more than a critic in these days. His own writing was beginning to mature. One of his main accomplishments was a sequence of poems which he called Hugh, Selwyn, Mauberley. To Archibald MacLeish, these poems were extremely meaningful.
Well, I've been increasingly impressed as I've been teaching up here at Harvard in the last 6 or 7 years by the vitality of Pound's work. I've been impressed by it, of course, as we all have, all my writing life, but perhaps I never saw it so clearly as when I came to teach his poems. Most work, you know, tends to go older with the passage of time, but his doesn't. It keeps its sharpness. It keeps its cutting edge. The metal is just as bright as it ever was, and I think it always will be. To me, Hugh, Selwyn, Mauberley, which is the poem I work with mostly with students here, is truly one of the major achievements in modern English poetry. A tremendous poem. And my own personal debt of gratitude and gratification for the translations, particularly the translations of Li Dai Bo, whom Pound calls Rihaku, calls him that because he came at him through Fenollosa, who was working in Japan. My debt of gratitude for those translations is simply immeasurable. I don't know what I could name that has given me deeper and more lasting pleasure than those things.
MacLeish's admiration for Hugh, Selwyn, Mauberley is shared by innumerable other critics. Pound has recorded 2 sections from Mauberley.
For 3 years, out of key with his time, he strove to resuscitate the dead art of poetry, to maintain the sublime in the old sense, wrong from the start. No, hardly, but seeing that he had been born in a half-savage country, out of date, bent resolutely on wringing lilies from the acorn, Capaneus, trout for factitious bait. Id men gartoi panpos and itroye, caught in the unstopped ear, giving the rocks small leeway, and the chopped seas held him therefore that year. His true Penelope was Flaubert. He fished by obstinate isles, observed the elegance of Circe's hair, rather than the mottos on sundials. Unaffected by the march of events, he passed from man's memory in l'antarantiem de sonneage. The case presents no adjunct to the muse's diadem. Go, dumb-born book, tell her that sang me once that song of laws, hadst thou but song as thou hast subjects known, then were there cause in thee that should condone even my faults that heavy upon me lie, and build her glories their longevity. Tell her that sheds such treasure in the air, recking naught else but that her graces give life to the moment, I would bid them live as roses might in magic amber laid, red overwrought with orange and all made one substance and one colour, braving time. Tell her that goes with song upon her lips, but sings not out the song nor knows the maker of it. Some other mouth may be as fair as hers, might in new ages gain her worshippers, when our 2 dusts with wallers shall be laid, siftings on siftings in oblivion, till change hath broken down all things save beauty alone.
Pound also in this period, before 1920, was starting what surely must rank as the most ambitious poetic project of our time, a series of cantos, which he describes as an epic poem which begins in the dark forest, crosses the purgatory of human error, and ends in the light, fra I maestri di color che sanno, among the teachers of the intelligent. Pound today is still adding to these cantos. Numbers 85 through 95 were published in November of this year in Italy. Among the earliest cantos written in London before 1920 are some of Pound's most brilliant poetic creations.
The first canto, which is, of course, an Englishization of a Latin translation of a section of the Odyssey, is nevertheless a superb piece of English poetry. There are no two ways about that. The second canto has magnificent passages in it. In fact, although I think the first 10 cantos decline from the first to the 10th, they include passages, and very extended passages, which any man alive would have been proud to write.
One such passage occurs in Pound's reading of Canto 17.
So that the vines burst from my fingers, and the bees weighted with pollen move heavily in the vine shoots. Chirr, 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 purring sound. And the birds sleepily in the branches, Zagreus, Io, Zagreus, with the first pale clear of the heaven, and the cities set in their hills. And the goddess of the fair knees moving there with the oak wood behind her, the green slope and the white hounds leaping about her. And thence down to the evening, flat water before me, and the trees growing in water, marble trunks out of stillness, on past the palazzi in the stillness. And the light now not of the sun, chrysoprase, and the water green clear and blue clear, on to the great cliffs of amber.
Disappointed by what he regarded as cultural decadence in London, Pound moved to Paris after the war. He became a famous and glamorous figure to visiting Americans who came there in the 20s. It was the era when everybody called everybody else the lost generation, when artists were searching for stable values in an unstable world. For Pound, these were days of intense activity, promoting the work of James Joyce, boxing with Ernest Hemingway, talking with Gertrude Stein, and always continuing to develop his own work. In this expatriate atmosphere, Pound never forgot that he was first of all an American. When, in 1912, Harriet Monroe, the editor of Poetry magazine, had asked him to become its foreign correspondent, he was quick to accept, writing, "Can you teach the American poet that poetry is an art with a technique, with media, an art that must be in constant flux, a constant change of manner if it is to live? Can you teach him that it is not a pentametric echo of the sociological dogma printed in last year's magazines? Are you for American poetry or for poetry? The latter is more important, but it is important that America should boost the former, provided it doesn't mean a blindness to the art. The glory of any nation is to produce art that can be exported without disgrace to its origin." William Carlos Williams spoke of Pound's thorough Americanism, and Archibald MacLeish was in partial agreement.
He was an American in spite of his not wanting to live in America. He was thoroughly American in spirit, and he would not lend himself to any British propaganda. He didn't avow his feeling but he wanted to break away from the staid teaching of English. And it is all his life, whether it was the Provençal or the Italian or the Italian classics, he never did know much Greek. I didn't think he knew any Greek, and only recently has he went over to the Greek. But he would not be bound by any rule. It shows in his first poems. He starts perhaps in the personae. He starts in writing something, and then he has to bust out. It would start regularly and then break out at the bottom of the thing, out after his own rule. He must have the say, the final say, and it was a good thing. He would not be limited to the English classical rules. So he got rid of the sonnet. That was from the Italian, but he wouldn't confine himself to any rule, and that is the essence of the American.
Well, I've always taken it for granted. He certainly is an extremely American poet, and he knows it. You remember how Hugh, Selwyn, Mauberley begins. It begins with E.P. Ode pour l'élection de son sépulcre, and the figure who is being measured for a tomb in that poem is just as American as Pound knew he was. Pound's excitement about Provençal poetry is American in kind and quality. His rhythm is American. His economic and political immaturity is American. Not that all Americans are economically and politically immature, but there's a kind of, naive rushing in to areas that wiser men would try to know a little bit more about before they entered, which is rather characteristic of American writers, has been in the past, and probably will continue to be. We have a lot of enthusiasm and a lot of rather rash courage sometimes. In spite of the fact that he pretended for a long time to detest the country, I don't think there could be any question but that the roots of his writing are here. At the same time, one has got to bear in mind that Pound is not a person who holds a basket out and inherits the work that's gone before him. He's been an enormous contributor. He's like a busy bee in the cultural flower garden. He's always cross-fertilizing, dragging things in. His responsibility, for example, for the influence of Corbière and Laforgue in the United States and in England is almost complete. He is the responsible person. Others had a part in it, but he's the man who made sense of it. And he's carried on this traffic. And this again, if Bill Williams means, if he's talking about Pound's psychological formation as being American, I would say this busy cross-fertilization, this busy teaching back and forth, which he's constantly doing, is very American. That's an American attribute, an American characteristic. We're interested in other people. We're interested in various chains and veins and derivations of cultural and other interests, and we tend to do that sort of thing. Europeans are more inclined to let well enough alone, to assume that each culture belongs to itself, and one culture is enough for any man to bother about, but not so Pound. So that you get a sort of paradoxical situation. I would agree with Bill that his psychological formation is American. I would want to insist that he has not, however, been a carrier of the American tradition, because he's been chiefly engaged in drawing other traditions into English. But then I'd have to come back and say, but this also is a very American thing to do.
From Paris, Pound's restless energy drove him to Rapallo, Italy in the mid-1920s. He lived there in seclusion, but young poets all over the world sent him manuscripts for editing and publication. Archibald MacLeish was one of these.
I know myself what would happen when you send him a manuscript. I sent him a poem for his little review called Exile, which he published in Italy for a while, and got it back with a great many suggestions for changes. They altogether altered the rhythm. They turned the rhythm over into his rhythm, which is understandable enough, because that's the only rhythm he can work in, his own. That's his character, his quality. But it was a laborious thing, and some of the suggestions, although none of them were suggestions I could accept, some of them were very exciting indeed.
Ever since the First World War, Pound had been growing more and more interested in economic theories. And when the Second War came, he gave a series of broadcasts on political economy over the Rome radio. These broadcasts, beamed to his own countrymen, constituted another of Pound's blunt efforts to reform America. When the Allies invaded northern Italy, Pound went out to meet them and their different opinion of his intentions. Arrested, he was imprisoned in the American Disciplinary Center at Pisa. Here, under conditions of incredible hardship, he wrote his famous Pisan Cantos. Dr. Williams vividly recalled his own reactions to Pound's achievement.
It is pathetic, and he was in dire straits at the time, and being imprisoned in a cage. He had no friend but a colored boy who used to appoint himself as his protector. Typical of the colored guys, and they're wonderful guys, and they have souls, they have ears, they have time, they have everything. And this man, whose name is I don't know his name, but he sensed that Ezra was in trouble, apparently, very definitely, in the boiling sun, without anything to protect him. But he did something to give him a little shade, which was a cruel thing for the United States government, but I don't want to start on that. But to imprison a man, no matter what his offense, so cruelly in a cage in the broiling sun, this man, it is a wonderful feat. He had no books, and he composed this intricate Pisan Cantos with great feeling, pathetic feeling, and his images are superb.
The poetry which came from this imprisonment, the Pisan Cantos, brought him in 1948 the Bollingen Prize, then awarded by the Library of Congress. That an award of this kind should be given to a man under indictment for treason brought howls of protest from many. But Archibald MacLeish, who had himself been on the committee, with Auden, Eliot, Robert Penn Warren, and 11 others, has never changed his opinion of the justice of the committee's decision.
Certainly the Pisan Cantos are anti-Semitic. Certainly they were anti-democratic. Certainly they were, in the strict political sense of the term, pro-fascist, although I doubt myself very much that Pound is a fascist, or ever was. I think his particular brand of political idiocy was of such a nature that the issues that the rest of us thought were around were irrelevant to him. But so far as the award to him went, it seemed to me that it was defensible, could be defended, and in fact defended itself pretty well.
One of the passages from the Pisan Cantos that has merited the highest praise is in Canto 81, as read here by Professor Louis Martz.
What thou lovest well remains, the rest is dross. What thou lovest well shall not be reft from thee. What thou lovest well is thy true heritage. Whose world, or mine or theirs, or is it of none? First came the seen, then thus the palpable Elysium, though it were in the halls of hell. What thou lovest well is thy true heritage. The ant's a centaur in his dragon world. Pull down thy vanity. It is not man made courage, or made order, or made grace. Pull down thy vanity. I say, pull down. Learn of the green world what can be thy place in scaled invention or true artistry. Pull down thy vanity, Pacan, pull down. The green cask has outdone your elegance. Master thyself, then others shall thee bear. Pull down thy vanity. Thou art a beaten dog beneath the hail, a swollen magpie in a fitful sun, half black, half white, nor know'st thou wing from tail. Pull down thy vanity. How mean thy hates, fostered in falsity. Pull down thy vanity. Wrath to destroy, niggard in charity. Pull down thy vanity. I say, pull down. But to have done instead of not doing, this is not vanity. To have with decency knocked that a blunt should open, to have gathered from the air a live tradition, or from a fine old eye the unconquered flame, this is not vanity. Here error is all in the not done, all in the diffidence that faltered.
In 1945, after the war was over, Pound was brought to this country to stand trial for treason. Declared of unsound mind before the trial was to begin, Pound was committed to St. Elizabeth's Hospital, a federal institution for the insane in Washington, D.C. He has remained there to the present day. At the time of his commitment, William Carlos Williams wrote, "When they lock the man up with Jim and John and Henry and Mary and Dolores and Grace, I hope they will give him access to books with paper enough for him to go on making translations for us from the classics, such as we have never seen except at his hands in our language." And Pound, under extremely trying conditions, did go on making translations of incomparable beauty, both from the Greek of Sophocles' Trachiniae and from the Chinese of the Odes of Confucius.
He has, while he's been there, done some extraordinary work. His translation of the song-word scripture, the Confucian Odes, is, well, it isn't as fine, I suppose, as his finest translations from the Chinese. It hasn't got the quality of those Li Daibo translations, the Bridge at Tenjin and so forth. But it's wonderful work, beautiful work. And my colleague here, Achilles Fang, who is multilingual to the point of being able to walk in and out of all the tongues, tells me that it's close to a miracle in terms of translation. That is, not really the translating of the poem, but the creation of the equivalent of the poem in the other language, which is all you ever really can do in translation of poetry.
Pound's great influence on modern poetry has touched, as Auden remarked at the beginning of the program, virtually every major poet of this century. Marianne Moore is one of them.
As an advisor, teacher, and as a poet, in his product as an example of what poetry is, Ezra Pound has been indispensable to me, and indispensable, I feel, to modern poetry.
Critics today have varied opinions about the essence of Pound's genius. Robert Penn Warren, for example, points out Pound's skill at creating images.
Well, everybody knows the enormous range of reference and the complication and power of Pound's intellect, and I'm afraid sometimes the confusion of it, and knows the great dramatic force, a sense of characterization, the flashes of characterization that appear in his work. But one thing that to come back to, perhaps in this age of criticism, to remind ourselves of, is the fact he was an imagist, and in one sense remains an imagist. By that I don't mean he remains one of that little group of the early part of this century, but his sense of the images, the freshness of the physical world, of the things seen, the things smelt, the things heard. There's no poet that more powerfully captures and represents to us that aspect of the world. I would like to read a passage or two of the sort that is constantly juxtaposed in Pound's cantos with the dialectical and discursive, satirical, and other elements. And by its that contrast gives its peculiar tremor, its peculiar urgency. One of the passages I like to read is this from Canto 2. It goes back a long way in his career. Lie the sinews of water, gripping her cross-hold, and the blue-gray glass of the wave tints them. Glare azure of water, cold welter, close cover. Quiet sun-tawny sand stretch, the gulls broad out their wings, nipping between the splay feathers. Snipe come for their bath, bend out their wing joints, spread wet wings to the sun film. Or to come late in his career to another flash of the world. Autumn moon, hills rise about lakes against sunset. Evening is like a curtain of cloud, a blur above ripples, and through it, sharp long spikes of cinnamon, a cold tune amid reeds. Behind hill the monk's bell, borne on the wind. Sail past here in April, may return in October. Boat fades in silver, slowly, sun blaze alone on the river. In contrast with all the other elements, in canto after canto, these flashes, pure and morning bright of the physical world, are probably the thing that will make Pound's work as abiding as any that we have in our time.
William Carlos Williams stresses a different aspect.
He has a wonderful ear for an ear which is the finest that has existed, has ever existed in the country. I think being a poet, and he with a wonderful ear for time gradations, the gradations of time, and therefore his meters are superbly modulated. His ear for time was the principal thing. Just the modulation of time, and it is wonderfully illustrated in the Pisan cantos.
Archibald MacLeish speaks in still different terms.
Pound is really writing a kind of sign language very frequently. He's condensing meanings into almost pictograms of imagery, pictograms of sense. Once you get the key, and that's why this sort of thing I was laughing at a minute ago is occasionally justified. Once you get the key, you get an enormously condensed and vivid and vigorous texture. You get that, for example, in Hugh, Selwyn, Mauberley, which is, to me, is easily his greatest poem. There, the texture, the poem is really composed pretty much as one might compose a poem if you were using a sort of picture language. These vivid images, sometimes images for ideas, not images of images, but a condensed, very sensuous texture, which, as I say, once you get the key, works. No, I don't think we any of us need to worry about Pound's reputation. He's been attacked more violently, I suppose, than any living writer in any language, and his reputation has grown as a result instead of declining. There are some things so good that you just break your fingernails when you slash at them, and he's one of them.
Stephen Spender, speaking from England, expresses his gratitude to Pound for what he has done for other writers.
It's a very great honor to be asked to send greetings to a great poet on his 70th birthday. Today, though, I don't think so much about the greatness of Ezra Pound's achievements as a poet, immense as these are, as about what he's done for other poets For instance, only yesterday I was reading a manuscript that had been sent into the magazine I edit in Counter, and I came across a remark by the author that at a time when James Joyce's stories, Dubliners, had been refused by 40 English publishers, Ezra Pound alone was going on trying to persuade publishers to take them. And then I think of the immense world of literature of the early Renaissance, the troubadours, Latin literature, Chinese literature, which Ezra Pound, through his translations, has made available for other poets. I think one could really describe Ezra Pound supremely as not so much a poet's poet as a poet's translator, a poet who has made whole literatures available to his contemporaries. So today, in greeting Ezra Pound, what I would like to do is to thank him for the tremendous example he's been to other poets as a technician and as a translator, and to thank him for the hundreds of acts of generosity by which he's been able to help other poets. Without this great generosity of his, without this great illumination, the whole situation of English literature today would be quite different.
W.H. Auden, in his flat in Greenwich Village, sprawling among scattered manuscripts and cats named for Italian opera heroes, feels that Pound's contribution to literature is threefold.
Poets who are influential on their own generation or succeeding generations can be divided into two classes. Those of which the influence is immediately discernible. For example, one might read a poet and say, oh yes, he's been reading Yeats or he's been reading Eliot. And there are others whose influence is more indirect. I think there are not many poets one reads, one would say at once, oh, this poet has been reading Pound. On the other hand, there are very few living poets, even if they are not conscious of having been influenced by Pound, who could say, well, my work would be exactly the same if Mr. Pound had never lived. His influence has been so all-pervading, so that a poet may, we'll say, have been influenced by Mr. Yeats or by Mr. Eliot, but then the question is, what effect had Mr. Pound already had, whether technically or personally, on Mr. Eliot, Mr. Yeats, and we know that he had. In my own case, I had a curious, I think, example of this, where in the last few years, I've got interested in certain kinds of rhythmical effects in poets like Wyatt, or even earlier in the 15th century. Now, I only realized quite suddenly that probably this started, this interest, through reading Mr. Pound's translations of Cavalcanti, where he certainly reproduces some of the effects of Wyatt. Now, I wonder whether I should have noticed these things in Wyatt if I hadn't already read Mr. Pound's translations. In general, I think one could say that Mr. Pound's prosodic influence in breaking a certain kind of jam into which poetry is always apt to get at one time or another has been immense on poets who write work of a very different kind. In a second way, his influence has been great in the way in which he has suggested certain reading material. I doubt if people would have got interested, we'll say, in writing sestinas if Pound hadn't started an interest in Provençal poetry. Some people imagine that to be, as Mr. Pound is in a certain sense, a literary poet, that is to say, a poet whose imagination is directly stimulated by other literature is in some way or other that is inferior than to be stimulated by, what should we say, a beautiful face or a beautiful sunset. That, of course, is all rubbish. The question is, what are the results, not the origin of the stimulus. One of Mr. Pound's most characteristic and, for my money, most admirable works is the homage to Sextus Propertius. Now, nobody can conceivably say, of course, that this is a translation. It's not in the least like Propertius, and some people have made quite good fun out of this fact. The only thing is, of course, that it's irrelevant. Here is a poem which is very characteristically a Pound poem, extremely beautiful and interesting, of which the original stimulus comes from Propertius. In fact, it's a very good thing, maybe, that Mr. Pound was not a translator in the ordinary sense, of somebody who tries exactly to reproduce in English what is said in the original text. There are other people who have done that. One of the great importances of what Mr. Pound has done is quite defiantly to take texts in other languages and make something exciting and new out of them. For these three reasons. Firstly, his general prosodic influence on all subsequent poets, his indirect effect on their interests, and his own achievement. I think every poet today would like to wish Mr. Pound well on his birthday.
Today, Ezra Pound is still in St. Elizabeth's, where students and critics visit him frequently, and from where he corresponds with his friends in all parts of the world. One of the oldest and closest of these friends, a grizzled old man with a stubby white beard, turned from his work on a new novel to answer the telephone.
Hemingway speaking.
Hemingway today expresses strong opinions on the matter of Pound's confinement.
I think that Mr. Pound has been sufficiently punished for any offenses that he may have committed against the government of the United States, and that any further punishment in any way should be classified as cruel and unusual punishment and contrary to the Constitution of the United States.
In 1925, in his essay Homage to Ezra, Hemingway wrote, "Ezra Pound devotes perhaps 1/5 of his working time to writing poetry, and in this 20% of effort, writes a large and distinguished share of the really great poetry that has been written by any American, living or dead, or any Englishman, living or dead, or any Irishman who ever wrote English. I do not mention other nationalities because I do not know the poetry of other nationalities, nor do I know Gaelic. There is only one living poet who ranks with Pound, and that is William Butler Yeats." Hemingway's concern for his old friend's present situation involves more than purely personal considerations.
Mr. Pound is a very good poet, and the sooner he's released to practice poetry, the better for the world.
Ray Ezra Pound.
E. Cummings speaking.
Poetry happens to be an art, and artists happen to be human beings. An artist doesn't live in some geographical abstraction superimposed on a part of this beautiful earth by the non-imagination of unanimals and dedicated to the proposition that massacre is a social virtue because murder is an individual vice. Nor does an artist live in some soi-disant world, nor does he live in some so-called universe, nor does he live in any number of worlds or in any number of universes. As for a few trifling delusions, like the past and present and future of, quote, mankind, unquote, they may be big enough for a couple of billion supermechanized submorons, but they're much too small for one human being. Every artist's strictly illimitable country is himself. An artist who plays that country false has committed suicide, and even a good lawyer cannot kill the dead. But a human being who's true to himself, whoever himself may be, is immortal, and all the atomic bombs of all the anti-artists in space-time will never civilize immortality.
Pound's continuing confinement in St. Elizabeth's Hospital is a source of grave concern to those who are familiar with his life and work. One of the aims of tonight's broadcast has been to present the feelings of some of the most distinguished of these men. But the primary purpose of tonight is to salute Ezra Pound at the beginning of his 70th year for what he has accomplished and for the great contribution he can still make to English literature. Our words at best will be quickly forgotten. His poetry will endure as long as men live to read it. For such a gift, the world must now decide how best to pay its tribute to Ezra Pound.